Hey there, my gorgeous friends on the internet. I don't have a hat to tip. Fresh shave, what's good? Today's episode, we're gonna look at 5 tips and tricks when it comes to Next.js. I know there's still a lot of confusion. People confuse like how caching works and server and client components. So I'll try to give you some really good tips here to make your life a bit easier. Oh, and I also want to announce my full in-depth Next.js 14 course 2024 edition. The first 4 chapters are live right now. We've done a full section on NextOff with 2-factor authentication, email resets, and everything else. So check it out at developbyact.com. I have a little video there that previews the project. So if that's something you're interested in, yeah, I appreciate it. Let's get into it. Did my hair just grow back? Anyway, so the first tip that we're going to look at is next images. There's a lot of confusion about this, like how does the width, how does the height work, and how does the blurring work as well, because it's quite different if you have a local image or a remote one. So let's just make it clear really quick. So when you have a local image, you don't need to specify a width and a height. Next.js automatically is going to identify it. So let me just plug in an image here that I have saved in my public. All right, so that's where you usually put your public images. So here we can just provide a source and I can import this JPEG or PNG or whatever you want. Let's call it ahoy from, and then using the @ symbol, you can just navigate over to your public and ahoy. Okay, so let's just render it out. And as you can see, you actually don't need to provide a width and a height. So let's just give it an alt. And Next.js uses this for like content layout shifts to make sure that it doesn't like pop in and then everything on your page starts moving. And there we go, looking good. So again, if you have a remote image, you can just specify a blur URL here. So you can say placeholder and you can do blur. Let's hit save. So let's give this a crack. So when we refresh, as you can see, we get a nice blurred image until it starts loading up. Okay, so let's get a remote image. I'll remove prime and let's just do Unsplash or something. Okay, here we go. Let's pick an image. Let's go with this one here. And let's just copy the image address. Okay, we'll create a function. I'll show you how you can do this, and then you can just do it for any images that you have, whether it's in your database, your S3 bucket, or whatnot. So let's just head to the home here, and I'll make a remote image and save this like that. Now, when you're working with remote images, you'll need to provide that blur data yourself. So there's a package that we can use to do that. We can use sharp and also placeholder. So let me just show you in my package.json. You can install these 2 packages, sharp and placeholder, but it's with an I like that. Okay, so make sure you type it correctly. So now that we have that, we can create another component here called base64. All right, let me just delete everything here. I'll show you how to set this up. So basically what you want to do here is let's import that package, placeholder like that, and we'll just import get placeholder. Cool. So here we'll just make a super simple function. It's going to be a server component, so we'll add the async. There we go, base64, and let's say this takes in a URL. You can do with multiple images if you want, of course. And all we'll do here is we'll do a try catch and try to convert that image over. So here let's do a fetch. We'll do res await fetch, and we'll pass in that URL. Now here we'll not need the actual like string of like the URL where the image is located at. Instead, what we need is the array buffer, and the array buffer just lets you hold the actual like binary data of the image. And then we can take that and convert it into base64, which is just like taking an image and like visually representing it in strings, right? And characters, long characters. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna get the array buffer and then pass that to the placeholder API. So what we'll do is say, well, first let's say if the response is not okay, then here we can handle that as well. So let's throw an error. Otherwise, we can access that buffer, and you can do that by res array buffer like that. Okay, and then here we can say await get placeholder, and we can just pass in the buffer from, and we'll pass in the buffer like that. Here you can extract the base64 format of that image, and we can just simply return that. And here where we catch an error, let's just say if error or e is instance of error, then let's console log out e.stack. Okay, so just a simple function, and then we'll head back into our app.js And now that we have that, we can just simply import it here. So let's say const blur data, and we'll set that equal to await, and we'll say get base 64. So we'll import that component and just pass in the image like that. That gives you an error. That's because we haven't marked this as async. And now if we console log out the blur data, you're gonna see that base 64 encoding right here. There we go. So that's all you need. And now you can just pass that data down just like you would in an image component. So source here is gonna be the remote image. And here, well, now we need to specify a width and a height because Next.js has no idea how, like what size this is, right? Because it's coming in from an API. So you need to specify this, otherwise you're gonna just get content layout shifts. So let's do, we're still gonna get some if I show you here. If I just put a low value, let's do 600, 600. I know the image is much bigger than this. And let's also do, let's hit save. So there it is. And then here for the alt, we can just say, I don't know, what blue balls. And the blur data URL is gonna be coming from this blur data now. So let's paste that in as well, curly brackets, and hit save. Okay, let's give this a shot now. But there you go, that's how you can add blurring to remote images as well. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Tip number 2 is gonna be about environment variables. Be careful when you're marking something with next public, that's gonna expose the environment variable in the browser. It's going to be available in the source code in the JavaScript bundle. So on build time, it will be added inside. Whereas if you don't add the next public prefix here, this will only be available in a node environment. Okay, so no access to the browser. So be very, very careful if you have API keys, especially if you have like a Stripe key, you know that you don't want people to have access to. Make sure you don't mark with next public. For tip number 3, let's talk a little bit about caching because it can be quite confusing for people that are getting into Next.js. So all I want you to know is that there is a big difference between caching in a production environment versus caching in a development environment. So what I mean by that, if I go here to the caching, let's add a paragraph and we'll just say math.random, okay? There we go. Let's hit save. And as you can see, you're gonna see that number right there. Now, when we refresh on every page, as you can see, it keeps changing, so it's dynamic. This only applies in development mode. Next.js's default behavior is gonna be to try to render this page out as static. So when you create a server component like this, it'll try to do that. So let me just show you. So if we do npm run build, let's run npm run build to create a production build here. As you can see, it generated some static pages, including the home page here. So let's run this, npm run start. And now you're gonna see that this is purely gonna be static. So I can refresh it as much as I want, nothing's gonna change. So there's like ways around this. So if, depending what you wanna do, you know, if you wanna just revalidate this data like once in a while, you can just add export const revalidate here. Revalidate, and let's set this to something like 5. So now as you can see, when I refresh, only once every 5 seconds that data is gonna be freshly refetched. There we go. If you want this route to be fully dynamic, on every time you visit the page it'll give you the fresh data, you can use this dynamic instead. Force dynamic like that. So let's give that a shot. Now every time I visit this page and refresh, as you can see, we're getting fresh data. Now be careful when you're also importing headers or cookies. Next.js you might not see it, but when you're running a production build, when you're building this out, you're gonna see this actually turns dynamic as well. So be aware, you might not use anything here that explicitly says that this route is dynamic, but just be aware when you're using headers and cookies and stuff like that. See, if I run it now, look at that, the page is fully dynamic as well. Okay, for tip number 4, don't use API route handlers to fetch data in your server components. I've seen this a couple of times and it's really not necessary. So let's say you have a route here, I'm just fetching like a joke from it, from the joke APIs. Okay, so I'm doing a fetch and returning the data here, res and success. Okay, so I can go to API/greet, and that's my response right there. Now, You don't need to create this route handler here, because what you generally try to do with Next.js is try to fetch everything in your server component. And then from there on out, if any client component needs it, you can pass it down as props, or you can use like a state management like React query to provide that data to the other client components. So where would you use a route handler? So don't do this, like don't do await fetch here in your home and then try to fetch that route handler. So don't make a request to your route handler. Instead, just fetch the data here like this. There we go. So now if we hit save, as you can see, we get the same effect. And if another component or server component needs this data, feel free to fetch it again. Next.js is going to optimize that for you automatically, and it's gonna cache this anyway. And if it's available and you're fetching in another server component, it's gonna just take that cache and pass it through, which is super cool. But if you want to like reuse this, you know, you might have like a dynamic fetch here or whatnot, or you want to reuse it in a lot of components, and this might be a bit like a bigger function. So in that case, what you can do instead is create a server folder here and create a server action, and then just reuse that data as well. So it would look something like this. We'd go over to our root folder, create a server like that, and here you'd have like your action where you'd maybe fetch or get joke.ts, let's call it that, add userver to the top. So it's gonna have kind of the same look to it, like that. So we have the data and the response, and here we can just return, we'll just return a simple object here. So if that's success, we can say return a success message, and we can say res like that. Otherwise, if there is an error, we can return an error instead. And the cool bit is now we can just import this anywhere we want. So let's just go here and say const joke equals await get joke. Like so here we'll have the data, and then we can check if the data is success or not. So data dot success, then we can render out whatever we want down here. So we'll say data success dot joke. Otherwise, if there's an error, we can say if data dot error. We can just throw a new error here with the message, and that's automatically going to be passed to the error tsx page in your file tree here, which is going to add the suspense and render that out instead. So now when you use this in combination with Drizzle and next safe actions, you're going to get that nice end-to-end type safety. And we're going to do that in the course. For tip number 5, let's talk a little bit about client components and server components. I remember at the beginning when I got started with Next.js, it was a bit confusing, like which component becomes a client component and is a server component, especially when you start wrapping stuff up with like client providers, you know, and stuff like that. So let me just kind of try to explain this really quickly. So by default, when you just create a page like this and you mark it as async, it's going to be a server component. And this is the convention you're going to see where people fetch data in here, and you can still add client components in here where you want the interactivity. Okay, so this is a client component here, show time. That's going to get the seconds of this minute. So when I click update, we get the latest value. So if we have a look here, this is marked as use client. So again, we can use state here, we can use effect, refs, everything, right? Okay, so there we go. So again, even though this is a client component, I can still compose it in here and keeping this a server component. Now, if in the show time here, I try to render out a child component within here, that is automatically gonna be a client component. I don't even need to mark it with use client. So let me show you. We'll create a new one. We'll call this so I'll just say something like child button here, .tsx. And let's just say export default function, child button. And we'll just return a div here with a button saying hello. And up here, let's also add a text. Now let's see if we have access to use state here, even though we're not marking this with use client at the top. So I'll just get the text and change the text. So let's say set text equals to use state, and by default we'll leave hello here. So let's render that out instead and hit save. Okay, so let's try to render this out in the get time here. So let's head back here. Maybe at the top here, we'll say child button like that. And now when we hit save, as you can see, I'm not getting any errors that, oh, you haven't marked this with use client, you're using use effect, you're using hooks or whatever. That's because it's a child component of it. unless, so as you can see, everything still works fine. We can go here and try to update this as well. So we can say on click like that. And let's just call a set text here to new value. Okay, let's hit refresh. And now when I click this, as you can see, we get the new value. So how in the world then are we getting, we've been told this, like, oh, when you do a provider in your layout, it'll still work as a server component. So as long as you pass the children down, it's still fine. You can still have a client component that renders out server components. So you're going to see this quite a bit. It's already set up for you usually where you're going to need these. So for example, in chat.cn, right, you want to do teaming. So let's head to the teaming here. Scroll down. Let's mark this as team.tsx. Paste that code in here. And now if we head over to our layout, again, the children here are still going to act as server components as long as we wrap that around it. So as you can see, we're getting the children here from the root layout. That's going to bring in the server component pages, and then we're just passing it down here. Okay, now let's run this up and I'll show you that this is not going to change anything. So if we run npm run dev, and I'll try to run in the children here, so any page that I have access to, let's say this home page, for example. So here, if I try to run something with useState, let's even remove this async here. So yeah, let's just paste that in, import useState, and you're gonna see that this is not working. So this is a good way that you could test if you want. You can just add a useState and see if it's gonna crash for you or not. As you can see, oh, that doesn't work. Boom, see, you're being stopped of doing that. So there we go. Thank you so much for watching this episode. Hope these tips and tricks helped a little bit, like clarify kind of the ambiguity that sometimes might be going on in Next.js. I'll head back to the course again, and the course will cover much more in depth. It's going to be like a 25-hour course. We're going to start from like buying a domain all the way to hosting it, creating products. We're going to hook up the drizzle there, and I'll show you some really cool stuff. So get back to editing that. Take care. Drop a sub, drop a like. Bye-bye.